This video was originally recorded February 2019 during the ongoing Force for Good class series. To learn more about this ongoing series, please visit tibethouse.us.
Notice. So that was the Tibetan language. Don't look worried. So there was Tibetans have a community center in Queens, and they had a New Year ceremony recently, and it was really nice. And I was very, very happy because Ocasio-Cortez came. So I got to have a selfie with Ocasio-Cortez. I don't know if you all are fans, but I'm a total fan. So I was really thrilled by that. Now, I'm here today. I'm Bob Thurman, and I'm the the figurehead of Tibet House. And other people actually do all the work, but I'm the figurehead. And David Kittay is my dear colleague, and he was my student for some years. And now he's a real great teacher. And I'm very, very proud of his work. His dissertation was the original translation of a work called the Vajramala, the Vajra Rosary, which is a very important tantric work, and rather difficult, and no one had ever translated it before. And he's gone on to translate a bunch of other things, working in a teamwork with another former colleague of ours, Geshe Jamspel, a wonderful Ladakhi, from this wonderful country that you see on the walls. These are photographs of Ladakh, which used to be Western Tibet, but now it's in India. So I just should have been here on the first lecture that David gave, which I think was the bottom falling out. I believe, I don't know if it's...
Did the bottom fall out? Who was here? The bottom fell out?
Oh, good, excellent. So I don't know what's falling out today. I'm not sure.
More.
But I should have been, but I was on a plane coming back from Sri Lanka, where I was leading a Tibet House trip. So I'm belatedly, and also online, introducing him as Dr. David Kittay, most remarkable of my colleagues, who teaches also very amazing modern things. Some of you, if you're from Colombia, you know that he teaches wonderful things about modern culture, as well as Buddhist studies he teaches. And he's putting the bottom back on today, or I'm not sure, taking the roof off today, maybe, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm very, very proud of him and grateful of him coming to teach at Tibet House. And this is in a series known as The Force for Good, which comes off of a book written by Daniel Goleman, which indicates, like Tibet House, the Dalai Lama doesn't want people to be Buddhists, unless they already are. You know? I mean, he doesn't want to convert people, in other words. He has a big thing about that, which I utterly agree with, because we don't want to start religious competition for market share, you know. But he has tried to stimulate different movements, like in science and psychology and in ethics and politics and business even, that sort of goodness, kindness, whatever is brought to the fore, which you can find in all the world religions and also in secular humanism, which he considers a world religion. So this is part of the Force for Good series here at Tibet House, okay? Thank you, David. So take it away, okay?
Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
I remember when I first started at Columbia as a student, I walked into Bob's office. I think I had met him by email, maybe once in person. I walked in there and he said, "Beats working, doesn't it?" So thank you all, and thank you all for coming. Just show of hands. How many were here last time? Okay, so that means the rest of you were not. Okay, that's good. So I'm also saying hello to all the people who are here virtually. Now, next week, not next week, but the week after, on the 27th, we'll do another one of these sessions where the focus will be on technology. And we'll see, I think, that it's possible that this is virtual right now. After all, you're just figments on the screen of my mind. Is that so? Or maybe we're all part of a simulation, some advanced civilization's high school physics experiment. So that could be. So hello to all you virtual people. Thank you all for listening in. And the most amazing, it's so remarkable that we're all here. Actually, I was driving down and I got very emotional about it. In fact, I was coming down to speak to all of you, that all of you, by virtue of some karma, some connections, that you're here and with each other, and that we're all here together. It's really quite amazing, all of the connections. And not only the connection, but the feeling that engenders, both for people you know who you came here with, and also for people you don't know. You look around, you look at them, you say hello. And that emotion, that kind of love, that kind of compassion, when you look at someone, when you feel them, is also one of the best entrances into what the Buddhists call wisdom. That is, they call it many different things. They call it the wisdom of emptiness. That just means it's empty of separation, that it all runs together, that it's all a product of causes and conditions. And so in my emotionality on the way down here, I said the mantra of Avalokiteshvara, which is the bodhisattva of compassion, Kuan Yin in China, which is Om Mani Padme Hum, which you hear all over Tibet and all through the tradition. And this is the mantra that embodies that feeling of connection. So I met a number of you when you came in, but what I'd like to do right now, for just 30 seconds or something, I'd like all of you to just turn around and say hello to whoever's around you that you don't know and connect with them. So everyone is welcome. Okay, that's the whole thing. That's all we wanted to have happen, really. But this is the miracle of pratitya samutpada, Tendrel, which is dependent arising, or as Bob calls it, relativity. That we all actually are connected, and in that connection, we see that what appears to be separateness really doesn't exist. So before we take on time and reincarnation, and I see here I wrote quantum gravity. As I said last time, what was I smoking? Let's give a little recap, because these teachings all run together. We started with a little reading last time from Paulo Freire, who is the great Brazilian educator, political activist, who critiqued what he called the banking method of education, where the teacher teaches and the students passively accept the knowledge, which all of you are very familiar with. And so tonight, again, let's make it a conversation. If anybody has a comment or a question, let's just all talk about it, right? Because it's much better, because that way everyone is focused on what you really want to know about, and that's the purpose of this. It's for you. Okay, so we spent a lot of time last time getting lost. The process of what I call a state of orientation, where the teacher tells you how you should look at something. Disorientation, where you can really get lost, and then you have to figure out yourself how to find something. And that kind of doing it yourself is much more valuable than when somebody just tells you something. And then we talked about the the notion of the water from David Foster Wallace's very famous commencement speech at Kenyon, where he talked about one fish swimming in the water and says the other fish, how's the water? And the other fish says, what water? And so we spent a lot of time last time trying to see our water, which we never look at, basically, because we're all involved in the ordinary affairs of the day. And so we took a little bit, tiny bit of teaching from the Mahamudra tradition, the tradition of the Great Seal, and used the flashlight analogy, where we alternated our perspectives. So we looked at something. We can do it right now. I'm looking at the corner of this table. Just look at something, chair, and imagine you're holding a flashlight, and imagine you're looking at it from the point of view of the holder of the flashlight. So you're very aware of you and your intention, pointing the flashlight, of the surroundings. And then we switched and said, okay, now let's just take on the point of view of the flashlight itself. Let's do that just from the point of view of the flashlight. No holder, just the flashlight, just perception. And we went back and forth, and what happens was that when you come back and you're just the flashlight, as opposed to the flashlight holder, there's a lot of stuff missing. There's a lot of baggage that was there when you were the holder of the flashlight in terms of your own intention, directing it. And I almost felt, I don't know if you did, or even in that short time, feel that when you're holding it, when you're the flashlight holder, there's kind of a 3D, it's three-dimensional. Imagine it, you're holding it. It's three-dimensional. And then when you go to just being the flashlight, it becomes two-dimensional. That whole third dimension disappears. So that's the stuff that's missing. And so the perspective of the flashlight really is an absence. And the absence of that, all the stuff we bring to it, allows us for a second to get over ourselves. And then when we go back to the flashlight holder, we see what we bring to it, right? Because we interpret anything through the lens of our own experience, through all our biases and preconceptions. And that generally, we talked about last time, is called hermeneutics, from Hermes, otherwise known as Mercury, who's the messenger of the gods, who tells us what the gods want. So hermeneutics is really interpretation. So by going back and forth between the flashlight holder and the flashlight, we get a fix on the water we're in. That is our sphere around us that we interpret through, right? So we did that, and so when we go to the flashlight and we just have our sense impression without all the holder stuff, there's this absence. The Buddhists call this emptiness, right? There's an emptiness that is an absence, hi Tony, of what was there before, right? And so we go back to the Heart Sutra here that we looked at last time, which is there is no eye, no ear, no nose. And the Heart Sutra is one of the most popular of all Buddhist teachings, chanted constantly in all kinds of monasteries. No eye, there's no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. And then you go all the way down, there's no ignorance, no elimination of ignorance, and so on up to no aging and death and no elimination of aging and death. Likewise, remember the Buddhist Four Noble Truths, right? Which are suffering, origin, cessation, and path. But the Heart Sutra says there's no suffering, no origin, no sensation, no path, no wisdom, no attainment. I mean, this is nuts, right? And this is the most prominent Buddhist sutra. So, but the Heart Sutra is talking about an absence. An absence. So if you can imagine there is nothing, there is none of that, then just like when you're the flashlight, it gives you a perspective on what's there when it all comes back in your normal reactive way of being. So this, in a way, this Heart Sutra, this is Buddhist wisdom. And what the great scholars like Tsongkhapa and Bob Thurman, his great interpreter in our present time, for which we're all astoundingly lucky, say that this is just the same thing as relativity. It's the same thing as dependent arising. It's the same thing as connection. Because once we get rid of all of this stuff, what we're really getting rid of is our hyped up idea of this stuff. Right? I can talk like David. David with a capital D. Oh, wow. Right? As opposed to David with a small d. Right? So we get rid of the hyped up stuff. And this is what the Heart Sutra is telling us. There's another way to look at it in a more practical way, and this comes from Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who's a monk originally from New Jersey, I believe. He's translated so many sutras on the Access to Insight website. It's a good website for looking up sutras. Anyway, he says, emptiness is a mode of perception, a way of looking at experience. It adds nothing to and takes nothing away from the raw data of physical and mental events, when with a flashlight. You look at events in the mind and senses with no thought of whether there's anything lying behind them. So with no thought of, oh, I'm the flashlight holder, I'm doing this, right? And that was very much my experience, maybe yours too, of when you switched to the flashlight. When you guys switched from the flashlight holder to the flashlight, did you go from 3D to two-dimensional? Anybody? Maybe yes, no, yes, no. Who's a yes? Who's a no? Who's a, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Okay, we'll keep going. What I was saying was that you know, if you just say the object I'm looking at is the corner of this table, okay? If I'm looking at it pretending I'm holding a flashlight, it's all through. I see you guys around here. I'm thinking about aiming the flashlight. I'm thinking about, should I turn it up lower or higher? What should I do? All that stuff. And the edge of the table is in 3 dimensions. So there's all this other stuff here. And I analogize this to kind of the water that we always carry around, which we live in, our biases and preconceptions. But when, at least my experience is, when you just focus on that as the flashlight, all that other stuff goes away. Right? And so it becomes almost 2-dimensional instead of 3-dimensional. So what's missing is that third dimension. And that third dimension being missing, that's a sense of emptiness, as Thanissaro Bhikkhu is telling about it. So we also talked about this little tool called How Much, a tool for dialogue, which has to do with, if you're disagreeing with somebody, you say, well, how much do you think that? Back and forth. You could do it with things as contentious as abortion. How much is it about woman's autonomy over her own body? How much of it is about the life of the fetus? How much? We talked about that. And then we talked about this emptiness, which is Buddhist wisdom, right? This sense of not overdoing it or underdoing it, the sense of nothing existing as being the best medicine, as the great teacher from the first century, Nagarjuna, said, as the best medicine for those who have the disease of reification. That is the disease of reification, meaning making something into a thing, meaning the disease of overdoing it. Because we, at least I, speak for myself, except when I'm depressed. When I'm depressed, I feel like I'm nothing, right? But when I'm in my usual overdone self, my problem is I'm overdoing it. I'm constantly overdoing it. So this sense of nothing exists, like the Heart Sutra. There's no eye, no ear, no tongue, no nothing. That's a great medicine for me, because for an instant, just like going from 3-dimensional to 2-dimension, all that stuff goes away. And then, when I come back, I get a perspective on that other stuff. And I say, wow, that other stuff is pretty weird. right? But otherwise, I'm just acting reactively, going about my daily life, thinking about nothing. So, so we were, and then we talked about that only a Buddha sees things simultaneously as both existing, no brainer, we can all see that, right? And not existing, seeing both those at the same time. That only a Buddha can do that. And so, so I'm going to talk tonight about time, a little bit about reincarnation, and then if there's time, about some of the crazy things I've been thinking lately, which have to do with quantum mechanics and stuff I'm completely unqualified to really even talk about at all. But there's going to be a theme, and I'm going to put it out there right now, right? And it's this, that when we say that a Buddha sees things as both existing and not existing, when it comes to not existing, do we mean not existing at all? Like, you're not even here, I'm not even here? Or do we mean not existing in an overdone way, as the scholars say, not inherently or intrinsically or separately existing? So it could be either one. And I'm saying that for me, and I think for most of us, when we're not depressed, it's very helpful, and the best medicine is spending a little bit of time thinking that nothing exists at all. This medicine is designed to get us to the point where we realize that what doesn't exist is the overdone stuff, right? David with a capital D, that I only exist, David with a small d. But in order to get over David with a capital D, good medicine might be saying, there ain't no David at all. Not even here. And then when I come back and say, well, wait, something's here, I see it in a different way, right? Just like when I went to the flashlight perspective, everything disappeared except for that immediate impression, right? So that I realized that there was something off in the way I was perceiving it. So that's going to be a theme, and we'll see it when we talk about time, and we'll see it when we talk about reincarnation. So, but the most amazing way in to this way of starting to see the water that we're in, and the easiest way for us as human beings, as mammals, is the way of compassion, as I mentioned before. Because when you're compassionate, when you love, then those barriers come down. And when those barriers come down, we can see things the way they are and get over ourselves. Okay, so, but what we didn't get to last time was how the Buddhist, within the Buddhist tradition, we look at experience and we look at texts, because this whole notion of hermeneutics or interpretation has to do with interpreting texts, like how do we interpret this Heart Sutra, right? And also experience. How do I interpret what's going on right now? And so the most fundamental way that Buddhists look at this for texts, and I believe for experience also, is what's called the 4 reliances. Very simple, 4 things. 1, rely on the teaching, not the teacher. 2, rely on the meaning, not the letter. 3, rely on the definitive meaning, not the interpretable meaning. And 4, rely on wisdom and not conceptuality. So let's go through them one by one, okay? Rely on the teaching, not the teacher. That can help. Often you'll see problems arising when there's a cult of the teacher, right? When it becomes all about the teacher. And of course, in the Tibetan tradition, we have very much a strong tradition of guru yoga. That is, the Tibetans, when they take refuge, and they say, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha, the Buddhist community, Tibetans start with, I take refuge in the Lama first, in the Guru first. So, and yet, these four reliances, which come from many, many sutras, you find them in a lot of places, say, think critically. Don't just take it because the teacher says it. And actually, Buddha actually said this. Buddha said, just as a goldsmith would test his gold by burning, cutting, and rubbing it, so you must examine my words and accept them, but not merely out of reverence for me. So Buddha himself says, don't just take it from me. You think about it, and only if you've examined it and it really makes sense to you, then take it in. He's saying, think for yourself. Okay, now, rely on the meaning, not the letter. Okay? Broadly speaking, well, what did my wife Jan mean when she said to me, oh, if you have time, could you... Was she just asking about my schedule? Or was she asking something a little bit different? So if you rely and take everything literally, you're not going to get that. So they say, rely on the meaning, not the letter. Like the great teacher Mipam Rinpoche said, the ignorant look at the finger itself when a finger points to the moon. Right? Fools who are attached to language alone may think they understand, but it won't be easy. So the first one is rely on the teacher, and the teaching, not the teacher, and then rely on the meaning, not the letter. Right? Now, for instance, if we look at this from the secret community, or Guhya Samaja Tantra, let me move this so you guys can see it over here. Right, it's very scandalous. Scandalous also because it's tilted, but that's okay. It says basically, those who have low birth, who do despised work and whose minds are bent on killing, succeed in this supreme way. This, by the way, is one of the most respected scriptures in Buddhism. Goes on to say, those who blame their teacher never succeed in sadhana, but those who destroy life and delight in lying, those who covet the wealth of others and are attached to sensual desires, those who eat excrement and urine, all these are worthy of the practice. Right? If you take this literally, you're going to violate some health codes, probably. Okay? So again, so how do we interpret this, for example? Right? It even goes on, it's even worse. The sadhaka, the practitioner who desires his mother, sister, and daughter, attains entire city, accomplishment. I mean, it goes on. How would you interpret this? Anybody? What do we do with this? Any ideas? How that's crazy, right? It's nuts. Okay. What do we do with this? Well, some people say that we apply something called connotative semiotics, academic word for a different meaning. For instance, like Wall Street is a street in Lower Manhattan here, but also we use it as referring to an economic system or greed. So if we say someone is pure Wall Street, you're not giving them a compliment, and you're not saying that they're made of asphalt and they're, in Lower Manhattan. You're not saying that. So Christian Wedemeyer, who's a great scholar, he says, well, really what this is saying is that this is transcending norms of purity that existed in India. And what it's saying is, look, I'm experiencing non-duality. I've gone beyond conceptuality. I can do all this and say all this. That it's really doesn't mean what it literally says. It doesn't mean you should do that. And in fact, back in 986 of the Common Era, there was a king of Tibet, Yeshe Od. And Yeshe Od, he wrote about people who were taking this literally, right? And he said, imprisoned in the dirt of the 5 kinds of sensual object in women, it is astonishing that these people say that we are the Buddha land by offering feces and urine, right? It's exactly what it says, to pure divinities. Alas, you will be reborn in a mire of corpses. He's saying you make a mistake. You'll be reborn as a uterine worm. When was the last time somebody said that to you? And he says, you worship the three jewels as Buddha, Dharma, and the Buddhist community with flesh, blood, and urine, ignorant of terminology. You practice it literally, right? Buddhists like this would surely be reborn as a demon. And then he says, what a strange Buddhist adhering to these practices. If these practices, like yours, what you're doing all these disgusting things, bring about Buddhahood, then hunters, fishermen, butchers, and prostitutes would surely have attained enlightenment by now. Right? So he was the king of Tibet. He was saying, what? And so, more broadly, so we can use a kind of higher level interpretation. And we see that here in this drinking song, which is by the a yogi Virupa, the drinking song where he says, the liquor girl enters the two houses, and he's interpreting in terms of yoga, in terms of tantric yoga, that the two houses are the two side channels, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on. You can see this. So one is the liquor girl, and Munidada, who's the commentator, says, oh, this is the central channel. And it's a whole commentary like that. So relying on not the literal meaning, but the meaning, right? So he says, do that. So now we're okay, right? Right? We should just do that. Just rely on the meaning and not the letter. It's pretty clear. We found a home now. It's all okay. But the answer to that is not. Why not? Okay. Remember, we were talking about the water, which we in our reactive selves just ignore. And, they make Alex and Colin and do whatever they do. They're not even thinking about it. They just do it, right? But here, we all came to a talk and are giving a talk on Buddhist stuff. So part of our water is this Buddhist stuff, right? It becomes part of our lens of interpretation. So we're talking about the water of our Buddhist teachings, which becomes part of our water, not like the clueless fish who said, what water? Because we know there's water, but now this Buddhist stuff has become part of our water. So then the next level of interpretation of these reliances are rely on the definitive meaning, not the interpretable. Okay, so now let's go back and look at the Heart Sutra. And the Chunda, the silversmith Sutra, right? Where Chunda, the silver it's actually from the Mahaparinibbana Sutra. He says, bhikkhus, monks, it is through not realizing, through not penetrating the Four Noble Truths that this long course of birth and death has been passed through and undergone by me as well as by you. What are the four? The noble truth of suffering, noble truth of origin, noble truth of cessation, and the noble truth of the Noble Eightfold Path, right? Makes sense, right? That's what we all learn at church. I mean, Buddhist temple, right? So, and then you have the Heart Sutra, which no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue. So which of these is definitive, meaning that's the one you follow, and which of these is interpretable? That's the one that you have to interpret to make sense of. What do you think? You think this is the definitive one you should follow? Right? Follow Four Noble Truths. Right? Make sense? Yeah? It's telling you what to do, not this crazy no eye, no ear, no nose. Right? No Four Noble Truths. What? Wrong. According to the lineage of the Dalai Lama, which goes back to Tsongkhapa, this one is definitive, and this one is interpretable. Now, how can that be? It's because this one has to do with the wisdom of emptiness. And so there's a lot of scholarship on this. And actually, the most wonderful book, if you're seriously interested, is Bob Thurman's Central Philosophy of Tibet, which is a translation of Tsongkhapa's Essence of Eloquence, which is all about this stuff. And I have to tell you, the introduction in that book, lengthy introduction, is one of the finest things about Buddhism. So I recommend it to you all. It's really amazing, and I don't just say that because he's here. Okay, so now, and in fact, in the Essence of Eloquence, Tsongkhapa, he lived in the 1300s, and he was an amazing scholar, and also an amazing yogi. So it was not only studying everything, he studied everything and wrote about everything, but he was also doing the practice, and actually, they say, became enlightened after he died in the transition to his next life. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So there's a big debate. There's a big debate between I think the last time I talked about the mind-only philosophers of Tibet. Okay? Mind-only, those people focused on the fact that anything that exists doesn't exist just by itself. It exists in conjunction with one's mind. Right? So, which is a wonderful insight, because after all, look around. Anything that happens, well, yeah, there's a table here, but now I'm looking at it, right? So there's that deep connection. That's what they emphasize. And they thought, these mind-only people, like the great, great Buddhist saint and scholar Asanga, that Sangha thought this was a little too hard for people. That you have to read it by qualifying it and saying it means there's no separate eye, no intrinsic ear, no separate nose, because otherwise people will think that there's nothing out there. Right? And so they came up with another system, and they decided, well, it wasn't this kind of thing, Heart Sutra and the related sutras, the Transcendent Wisdom Sutras, that were definitive, but rather this other sutra, the Elucidation of the Intention Sutra. And but the fact that Tsongkhapa, Dalai Lama all find this to be definitive is some more ammunition for my view that you got to spend some time thinking nothing exists. Right? As my teacher, who's from Ladakh, Losang Jamspal, says, you don't exist, I don't exist, what we're translating doesn't exist, none of it exists. It's good to just dip into that. Don't get too lost in it, right? And then you walk around, you're going to walk into doors, you're going to walk out window, you'll be in big trouble. But just let's take a few seconds. Let's just imagine nothing exists. All gone. Then, what we see here, it's here. But if nothing exists, but this stuff is here, then the only way it can exist is like it's an illusion, like a magician's trick, right? If nothing exists, then you're here like an illusion. And in fact, this, seen in a very positive way, makes us able to connect. Because if everything were really here with a capital R, right, you'd never be able to connect. You'd never be able to get over yourself enough to connect. But the fact that things exist, but in an illusionary, playful way, allows us to do things, allows us to interact, allows us to have fun with it, allows us to run for Congress, allows us to help people, allows us to be artists, all the above. So So that's the third reliance, and the last one is rely on wisdom, not on conceptual consciousness. And again, this is the highest of the four reliances. Rely on wisdom, not on conceptual consciousness, because conceptual consciousness is just concepts. We know, very language bound. It's the world in which we live. We're constantly using language to do that, as opposed to direct experience. So in a way, this kind of being the flashlight is analogous to this direct experience, the direct experience of wisdom. And Mipam, this great teacher, who lived the late 1800s, he says, when taking the definitive meaning into experience, do not rely upon the ordinary dualistic mind that chases after words and concepts, but rely upon non-dual wisdom itself. Talked about the naturally occurring wisdom that illuminates itself. And this is the object of a number of Buddhist practices. Mahamudra, where one focuses on mind, and what is mind, and the natural luminosity of mind, and Tantra's perfection stage, and creation stage also, where one goes through at first imagining the death process, and then really going through the death process where everything disappears and then comes back. And so this is the last one, and Bob mentioned that one of the things that we've translated is this Vajra rosary, this Vajra mala. That says, I love this, the seal of the wisdom of the Buddhas is the state of non-conceptuality, the abode of indestructible Vajrasattva, who's the Buddha of purification, the great bliss of non-conceptuality, naked like sky. So these are analogies, this absence. Right? We're always walking around in the conceptual presence of everything, this absence like sky, this spaciousness gives us just a glimpse into what that kind of wisdom could be. But we need the conceptual reasoning, which my first teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, and also Lama Yeshe used to call it blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of blah, blah, blah. We need the blah, blah, blah to get to the point where we can learn something, where we can start to identify what our water is, and then eventually go beyond it. So the bottom line, I would say, is that nothing exists, and what we see here is like an illusion that we can play with in order to perform the only thing that Buddhism is about, and that is to benefit others. That's it. So if we get over ourselves, then we're finally free, and we can be more effective in acting in the world, like AOC, to benefit others. Okay? Now let's talk about time. Ready? Okay. Any questions? Comments? Yeah, Soren.
Focus on the meaning, not the letter. What is meaning without language?
Well, I think what he's talking about is where there is language, focus on the meaning. Right?
How can one conceptualize?
You can't focus on the language without there being language. So it presupposes there is language or something to take literally. Right? But focus on the meaning of the language, not the language itself. Like Mipam says, the finger is pointing at the moon. Don't focus on the finger. Focus on the meaning of that somebody is showing you the moon. And yet there is that gesture, right? So he's talking about how it is in the world. There is language, there are gestures, there is meaning, and how you should interpret those things. That make sense? Focus on the meaning, not the language. You start with the language, but get the meaning. Okay? Okay, time. Time. You guys like time? How do we feel about time? How many people like time? How many people hate time? think the hates have it. I think I'm with you guys, the hates. Okay, time can make us feel, at times, helpless and anxious, right? Time marches on. How did I get to be this old? How did that happen? Or time flies. Or no time to waste. Is this how we normally think about time, as opposed to the great sage Willy Wonka? You guys study him? No. He said, so much time, so little to do. It's one of my favorite things there. Anyway, but ordinarily, our ordinary conception of time is that it's independent of us, and time is just marching on, right? And that word independent should show us something, tell us something immediately, because we've already seen through the Buddhist view of emptiness that everything depends on everything else. That's why they call it dependent arising. So we have this feeling about time that's independent of us. That should be a clue that something's wrong about that. And also, we now know that nothing exists, much less exists independent of us. So this notion of time marching on independently of us is a little suspect, I think. Now, there are two ways in terms of the scholars of time, those who study time, the timeologists and the spaceologists. There are two ways of looking at this. One is we look at it as substantive, that time exists. This is called substantivalism. And another way of looking at it, for space also, is relationalism, right? Substantivalism is saying that time and space really exist as separate entities, like containers. But let's think about space first. We're all here, right? Space. And is this building, this air, all of us, are we all contained in a larger thing that is called space? Right? We normally think, yeah, right? Make sense? Nicole, make sense? Kind of makes sense. And so let's think about that. Let's visualize that we're here in this room. But all of this is in this container of space. Let's go there. Let's think about it right now. All in this container of space. Visualize it. This big thing container. Maybe it's like a big, like cube, this huge cube, and we're all in it, right? Right? Now, get rid of the container. It's gone. We're still here, but we're not in anything. We're just in different spatial positions, right? So that's relationalism, looking at space just as the difference between this and this, not as some overall container. And we know from Einstein that we have space-time, four-dimensionality of space-time. And time is the same way, right? We can imagine, and I think we normally do, that we're in a container of time. And it's just going on independently of us. But we can also think about time as just expressing the difference between people and things without an overall container of time. Are we okay? The two ways of looking at it, substantivalism, big container, relationalism, no container. It's just measure of the difference between us. Right? So, Nagarjuna, the great sage, in his great work, the fundamental verses on the middle way, Mula Madhyamaka Karika, thank you. He has a little chapter on time. We're going to go through it. Okay? So I'm going to give these out. This has the four reliances. Maybe we can pass them around. This has the four reliances. And chapter 19 from Nagarjuna, and also a little excerpt from the Zen master Dogen's Uji, which means being time. Okay, so let's look at what Nagarjuna says about time. And I have to tell you that, that it's not easy. It's not easy. You know, these are translated from the Sanskrit, they're short, but I'm going to unpack it as best I can. Okay? And so if you look at the first two paragraphs, right? He says, if the present and the future depend on the past, then the present and future would have existed in the past. Okay, now I'll be honest. I've spent, I don't know, over the past 24 hours, maybe 5 hours going over this. I think I got it. Okay, but I want you to have it. Okay, so this is what I think he's saying. Okay, we normally think of the past. See, he's talking about if the present and future depend on the past, then the present and future would have existed in the past. Now, we normally think of the past, present, and future as being separate things, right? The past is gone, the present is always here, and the future is never here, right? We think of them as being separate. I mean, just think about it. The past is past. I live for the present. Whatever happens, happens. But this actually is contradictory to our ordinary way of using language, because we know that past, present, and future, they're all dependent on each other. That's how we define them, right? That the present is something that's not past and not future. So there's something a little weird about the way we think about them as being separate, and yet there's something is deeply wrong about our conception of time. Now, Tsongkhapa, who did a commentary on this, he explains that what he's saying now is he's critiquing the notion that the present and future are deeply dependent on the past, that they're inherently dependent on the past. It's not like a plaything. They're just dependent on the past. And he's saying, doesn't really make sense, okay? And he doesn't want Tsongkhapa, and he's saying nothing exists. He wants to say nothing exists in an overdone way, because in his time, in Tsongkhapa's time, and this is where it gets academic and it gets confusing. And this is why the scholars in the Buddhist monasteries spend years and years and years unpacking all of this, debating it too. So Tsongkhapa was concerned in his time, there are a lot of people walking around saying, nothing exists, I can do whatever I want, no problem. So Tsongkhapa he didn't want to say nothing exists, so he said like nothing inherently, nothing separately exists. That was his thing. And again, my interpretation is more crude, because I need to experience, I think most of us need to experience, if only for a few minutes a day, nothing exists. That way, we can start to get over our feeling of existing in some separate and overdone way. Now the next thing says, number two, if the present and the future did not exist there, how could the present and future be dependent on it? Same point. Right? To be dependent on something, you have to coexist with it. Something can't be dependent on something else if it doesn't exist in the same time frame. Right? To depend on my parents, I had to coexist with them. I can't think of myself as being totally separate than my parents while acknowledging my dependence on them. Freud would agree. Okay, and then he goes on. Again, Tsongkhapa said the target here is this overdone notion of the relationship between the present, future, and past. So he's attacking that, and then he goes on, Nagarjuna says, if they're not dependent on the past, neither of the two would be established, therefore neither the present nor the future would exist. He's saying that by definition, in our ordinary language, the present and future depend on the past, right? So if the present and future were not dependent on the past, they couldn't exist. Without my parents, I couldn't exist. So the future and the present are neither dependent on nor independent of the present. And Tsongkhapa says, so they neither exist inherently dependent on the past nor independent of the past. He's looking at the different ways we conceive of them as existing, these periods of time, and he's saying it doesn't make any sense. They can't be true. And so he says, just like the horns of an ass. And I think he's saying something about our ordinary conception of time, that it's maybe not the most intelligent grasping of time. And then he goes on and he says that you can do the same thing with space. So you can't look at upper, lower, and middle as being, completely different from each other, right? Even though we generally say, oh yeah, he's upper class, he's lower class, he's middle class, right? But you can't, because these are all deeply relational. And then he goes in the end, he says a non-static time is not grasped. Nothing one could grasp as stationary time exists. If time is not grasped, how is it known? Well, you can't grasp moving time, right? A non-static time means moving. You can't grasp it because it just slips away. How are you going to grasp it? And there's obviously no such thing as stationary frozen time. So again, if it's not one, not the other, it can't really exist. He's showing us it doesn't exist. And then at the end, he says, if time depends on an entity, then without an entity, how can time exist? He's already proven in the prior chapters that things don't exist. So if time is dependent on an entity, like I was saying, the relational concept of time, it depends on just the difference between all of us and where we stand in the space-time continuum, right? If that doesn't exist, if things don't exist, then time can't exist either, right? So no version of time, not the substantivalist version, not the relationalist version of time, just can't exist. Now, of course, we could say with Tsongkhapa, what he was emphasizing is we just don't want to overdo our notion of time, right? We just don't want to overdo it. We want to have it, it's a time, but it's a relational time, it's a dependent time, but I like better. I like the damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Maybe not all the time, but at least for some time. For me, it's very therapeutic, right? So time, like you, me, like everything and anything, doesn't exist at all. And that's strong medicine, right? Let's go there. Imagine. Time is a fantasy. It doesn't exist. Neither do we. It's really cool, isn't it? It's very liberating. There's really nothing to be anxious about, nothing to get all puffed up about. Well, the Dalai Lama says, he also says, apart from the temporal phenomena upon which we construct the concept of time, like we see things changing, plants growing, etc., things moving, there's no real time. That is somehow the grand vessel in which things and events occur, right? An absolute that has an existence of its own. So this is the same reasoning that the Buddhists use to say the self is empty, the self doesn't exist. This old famous Buddhist doctrine of no self, right? And Nagarjuna is applying it to everything. And we have to remember, in negating all of these things, it doesn't exist. You don't exist. I don't exist. Rory doesn't exist. That's a hard one. But in doing that, we have to remember that that statement doesn't exist either, that they don't exist. None of it. Just gone. Okay, so now part of my enthusiasm for this sort of nothing exists interpretation of emptiness has to do with some acquaintance with my own order, right, with who I am. I suspect I probably have a lot in common, or something in common with you guys too, or at least some of you some of the time. When I asked Jamspal, my teacher and co-translator, some time ago whether he thought my problem was anger or attachment, he laughed and said, attachment, I think. He was right. So for me, very important to get over that by thinking and meditating that nothing exists. And maybe that will lead to a higher understanding, because as we also talked about last time, all of Buddha's teachings, because Buddha taught for so many years, taught for about 40 years to all kinds of different people, are very much designed to teach people based on where they are and what they need, what kind of medicine they need. So as one gets better and healthier, one needs different kind of medicine, maybe a more subtle kind of medicine. But from my crude place, nothing exists, but things exist, but like illusion, which we can play with to help people. I like that one, that helps. And I've also found, I have to tell you, that one of the things that we're working on now is a translation of a text called the Symphony of Dharma, which is very much like this Heart Sutra. And it's got passages like this. The leading character in it is a bodhisattva called Niramba, and he's being questioned by Shariputra, who's another but close disciple of Buddha. And it means, Niramba means beginningless. So this guy's name is Beginningless. It's a pretty cool name. And Shariputra says to Niramba, "O child of good family, why are you called beginningless?" And Niramba says, "O venerable Shariputra, the state of the activity," I'll skip. "O venerable Shariputra, from primordial time, one doesn't exist. Therefore, I'm called beginningless. O venerable Shariputra, if something existed from the beginning, one could begin it. But nothing has existed from the beginning, and because of not existing from the beginning, all things are beginningless." And I have to tell you that translating this and being in this worldview, I find to be immensely therapeutic for me. Can't tell you why. Maybe, we must have some social workers and psychologists in the audience. Probably has something to do with all that family stuff. But I do find it immensely helpful and therapeutic. So let's think about that and keep that as a medicine and maybe try it out, because as Lama Yeshe says, these teachings are there so you can try them. Right? So try them. You see, imagine nothing exists and then come back. You see things are, don't worry, you're not going to get lost. All right, but imagine nothing exists and come back, see if it helps you. Now, the last thing on here is a great work by Dogen, the Zen master. He lived around 1200, in the early 1200s. And he says, and Uji is translated, U is being, and Ji is time. And so he has this one word, which is a combination of being and time, which right away clues you in that he's talking about the deep connection between being and time not being separate than being. And what he says is sometimes standing so high on a mountaintop, sometimes walking down on the bottom of the sea, sometimes a three-headed, 8-armed demon, sometimes a 16 or 8-foot Buddha, right? That's what time is. In other words, time is you. Time is me. Time is water dripping from a faucet. That's what time is, these things. There's no separate time. And he says, the so-called sometimes, Uji, means that time itself already is none other than beings, that beings are all none other than time. The 16-foot golden body itself is time, and just because it is time, there is the luminous glow of radiance of time. It's a whole nother ecstatic version of time, right? Not the container. But now, what does he say? And you must study the matter right within this 24 hours? What? What? So he brought us to this place of ecstasy, no time at all, and then he's talking about my clock. He's saying something. He's saying that we also must be mindful of the conventional, of time as we all use it every day to get along in the world. Remember, that's the conceptual consciousness, which is superseded by the wisdom consciousness. So when he's talking about the golden Buddha is time. He's in the land of wisdom consciousness, and then he comes back and he says, but be careful, and remember your parking meters. Remember to plug them, and got to be on time. So Nagarjuna and Dogen both show us that we are time, and that other than us, there is no time. Right, now let's go back to the flashlight. Right, our ordinary perspective is that of the flashlight holder. And remember, I think I mentioned this last time, because our vision is so narrow, right, what we see is so little of the visual spectrum that if there were 6 million people on Earth and 2,000 Earths, right, all those people, we'd only see 42 people. That's how little we see. But imagine that we're holding a flashlight and we're looking around at the room and we're thinking about time. Right? From the perspective of the flashlight holder, there is time. I just thought to myself, how long have I been blathering on? Okay. Okay, this is our ordinary water. This is how the perspective of the flashlight holder, right? The water we're in, the temporal water we're in, the water of time. We're always thinking about time, right? And we naturally, have this time's marching on, I'm trapped in time, there's no time for this, there's no time for that, from the point of the flashlight holder. Then, let's see what happens when we become the flashlight. Just where we are, go. What happened to time? Did it change? Anybody? Maybe not. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. For me, when I go to the flashlight perspective, not the flashlight holder, time stops or changes dramatically. I'm not sure which. Now we go back to the flashlight holder, and it's like, just like me. It's like, how long has this guy been talking? When can I leave? Right? Just so you want to know, it's 8:11. Okay. So, but Dogen says that too, right? You have to look at the 24 hours. But there's a change in perspective. So really, like beings, time doesn't exist. Now, it's pretty cool that by going to the flashlight perspective rather than the holder perspective, you can stop time. And in your own life experience, there are some times when time stops. I know, actually, David Eagleman. Anybody know David Eagleman? He's now at Stanford now. But I have to admit, I was with him at Burning Man, and he told me he's a neuroscientist, and he said that he wanted to test this notion we have. This notion we have that when you're really scared, right, and you're like in a life-threatening situation, time slows down. Has anyone ever experienced that? Like you're in a car accident, you're skidding, and it's like that. So he had to design this experiment where he had this huge water tower, and he had a watch, and the watch was flashing the numerals, but it was flashing it too fast to see. And then if time were to slow down, the person would be able to see the numerals on the watch if it slowed down at all. And then he had them jump off the top of this water tower like 300 feet up. There was a trampoline or something back then. I had them look at the water tower and to see if time was actually slowing down. The answer was no, it wasn't. They couldn't see it. So he decided that it was really a function of memory. It's our memory for doing this. But actually, we have some support for this different view of time. This time doesn't exist from science. We have any physicists out here? Okay, I need some physicists, okay? But we know that Einstein's theory of special relativity destroyed the notion of the uniformity of time, right? The twins paradox, right? Where, and time actually stops when you go the speed of light, right? Which means for photons, there's no time. Maybe we're made of photons. Not only that, but depending on how far a particular event occurs from you, time will be different. So there are events on Mars happening that for a 15-minute period on Mars that is neither past or future for us. It's an extended present. And in the Andromeda Galaxy, which I read this morning, is on a collision course with us. I think something like 600 million years, that's it. But events in the Andromeda Galaxy that are happening in a single present could be within 2 million years for us. So there's no single time. There's no uniformity of time, and that's just special relativity. General relativity completely destroys this notion of there being a container of time, and anybody read anything of Carlo Rovelli? A wonderful physicist, leading physicist. He's working on quantum gravity now. He's Italian, but his works are translated, and he's the most wonderful lyrical writer, and he writes so, even I can understand most of the time, but he writes about this. He says, "We are not contained within an invisible, rigid scaffolding." Right? The scaffolding of time and space. "We are immersed in a gigantic, flexible mollusk." Mollusk. Right? And that's what Einstein said. And what curves is space-time. Now, if you're in a giant flexible mollusk, that's where we all are, then the last thing you're thinking about is time. You're probably wondering if you're going to get eaten up, right? And what about Nagarjuna, who says that the same logic that destroys the notion of an independent real time also destroys space, right? What? And that was the fourth paragraph of his chapter 19. Nagarjuna comes to the same conclusion as the physicists now working on quantum gravity. Oh my, are we back in the vortex yet? Time falling away, doesn't exist, right? And we're not done yet. So Rovelli writes about quantum gravity. He says, "What is the world made of? The backdrop of space has disappeared. Time has disappeared. Classic particles have disappeared, along with classic fields like the electromagnetic field. Gone. So what is the world made of? The answer is now simple. The world is made entirely from quantum fields. These fields do not live in space-time. They live, so to speak, one on top of the other, fields on fields. The space and time that we perceive in large scale are our blurred and approximate image of one of these quantum fields, the gravitational fields. Everything that we're seeing here is only, remember how little of the visible spectrum we see, our blurred, incredibly narrow vision of this gravitational field. And he adds, moreover, that it's only because of this blurring, the way we see things, that we've decided that we have the second law of thermodynamics, of entropy, that things become more and more disordered. And that is the only law that requires time to exist. And the only reason that it exists for us is because our vision is blurred or narrowed so that we see what we interpret to be a configuration, which is entropy, and therefore we have time. He says, if we saw everything, if we could somehow see everything, there would be no time. Because there would be no entropy. It's only our narrow vision. And of course, this goes back to the notion of the water that we're in. So now we're talking about, our most fundamental water. We perceive space and time, the things that Kant talked about as being inherent, not so. And so the question is, how did Nagarjuna come to the same conclusion as Einstein and the and the quantum gravity physicists? Well, Nagarjuna didn't have particle accelerators and whatnot, but he was doing what, and I love Bob's term, he was a psychonaut. He went deep into his own examination of the subjective side, and we all know that that consciousness, the notion of qualia, what is it like to experience what you experience, is something that, although we're starting to make some progress on seeing how that is reflected in brain function and whatnot, we have no idea what causes what. It's still a big mystery. And Schrödinger, Erwin Schrödinger, who's one of the fathers of quantum physics, also was a Greek scholar, and also wrote, it's one of the great things I assign in all my classes, who says that anything you learn in a specialty has no meaning except as it relates to all the other fields of human knowledge, right? Because to a carpenter, everything is a nail, right? So we need to connect all these things. But Schrödinger, he said, and this is way back, this many years ago, he said, now we understand that particles of matter over time have no continuity or sameness, right? Although, he says, it might be convenient to express oneself so. The same difference between this notion of ultimate reality, things don't exist, and conventional reality, yet they're here, and we talk about them, and we have language about them, and we live in this world, and we can use that to help others. He says, it is beyond doubt that the question of sameness, of identity and sameness, really, truly has no meaning. Oh my goodness. I mean, we're back in the vortex again. We're like falling. It's like, everybody remember that movie? You don't remember. I should know not to make any cultural references anymore. I really should. But anybody see a movie called High Anxiety? Mel Brooks movie? See? Okay. It starts out where he's in this vortex and he's going like, oh. You didn't see it, Bob? And he said, Mel Brooks is going, ah. Anyway, so here Nagarjuna came to his conclusion in a way, you could say the same way Schrödinger did and Einstein did, by thinking deeply about it and applying reasoning. Einstein actually came up with many of the things he came up with, not by doing the math, he did the math later, but by thinking deeply about it and coming up with ideas. And so deep analysis, whether through subjective meditation, right, whether examining a chair or the edge of a table, or our minds themselves, or through the scientific method, again brings us to this same wonderful vortex where everything we thought existed doesn't exist. Okay, except Kaya and Cynthia exist. They just came. Hello. Okay, so and remember that it's things not existing that allows them to exist conventionally, that allows us to play with them because they're no longer these givens, these solid things that are trapping us. And so this is the point of this wisdom of emptiness. But remember, we have to, even though time doesn't exist, we'll plug the meters and be on time. It's respectful to others. Okay? Now I'm going to talk about reincarnation and karma. We have a little bit of time. And if there's time, I'll talk about my obsession these days, which is how the many minds theory of quantum mechanics may explain reincarnation, karma, and tantra. I don't know if I'll have time for that, but if we don't have time for that this time, then I'll really think about it more, and in 2 weeks I'll talk about it. But first, question. Does anyone here remember any of their past lives? Show of hands. Don't be shy. Usually, I ask this question at Columbia, especially when I teach the course on reincarnation. It's called Reincarnation and Technology. Inevitably, one or two students do have some memory of their past lives. And it's really interesting because I teach a lot of courses that have technology in the title. So a lot of engineers take them, and which is amazing because very often the students who have these kind of memories, it's not the religion students, it's not the lit crit people, it's the engineers, right, who normally don't come from that kind of place. So I'll tell you a few stories. They're not about reincarnation, I just want to check you up, okay? So one time, one of my students wanted to do a project. She wanted to do it on past life regression. Anyone ever do any past life regression? Like hypnosis and stuff? Okay. And so I noticed that the psychologist who does a lot of these things, I forget his name, you probably know. Wiseman, yeah, he was going to be at the Javits Center. And so I said, he's going to be at Javits Center, why don't you go? And so she went. She's a computer science minor, I believe. And so she came back the week after. And I said, well, how was it? And she said, well, I'll tell you what happened. I got there, and Wiseman said, pick a partner, and now exchange something that you wear and have your partner hold it. And so she took off a watch she was wearing, gave it, and this woman gave her a piece of jewelry, and then Wiseman said, okay, now close your eyes, and my student went first, close your eyes, and what do you see? And she had been paired with a woman from Barbados, okay? And so she was holding it, and she said, well, sounds crazy, but I see you skipping through the mountains of Switzerland, like the sound of music. And the woman from Barbados said, I grew up in Switzerland, and I used to skip in the mountains. And wow. So then it was time for the woman to, holding onto this watch, to say something. And she says, I see a field of ice with a spotlight in the middle and a man in the spotlight. In Virginia, sorry. And she says, North Carolina says to herself, what? It doesn't make any sense to me. And then she remembers whose watch it was. It was her grandfather's watch. And her grandfather was the man who ran the Zamboni machine. Anybody know what a Zamboni machine is? Ran the Zamboni machine, so he was the man in the spotlight on the ice, like that. So I said, what do you do with that? She said, I'm not sure. Then in one of my classes, we had Karen, and Karen spent many years as an emergency room nurse and then a hospice nurse. And in one of the breakout discussions we had, Karen happened to mention that 6 or 7 times, and Karen, you have to meet her, she's very down to earth. She's just like, there's nothing woo-woo about her. And she says 6 or 7 times when she was in the operating room, the patient flatlined and then was revived, and then described what went on in the operating room from a position usually way up at the ceiling, different than where the patient was. And it's one thing, you can read about this when I read about this stuff in some of these books, I'm always very skeptical. I'm always like, yeah. But to hear it personally from somebody who was there, who's really testifying, wow, like what is that? I'll tell you one more. Okay, so we were doing a class on aliens, a book by Jeff Kripal, who's a scholar of religion down at Rice University, who wrote a book jointly with Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber is the guy who created a sensation by maybe 20 years ago, saying he had been abducted by aliens. They took him on the spaceship. They gave him a probe in a place where it hurt, and then this whole movement of aliens really took off. They were contacted by thousands of people who claimed the same experience. So, I don't know. I think maybe I asked them to comment on, if they wanted to, if any of them had been abducted by aliens. First, computer science major, right? Down to earth. I have two specific memories of being visited by aliens. First, I vividly remember waking up to two gray aliens standing on each side of my bed. I didn't know what they were at the time, so I wasn't immediately scared. I just stared at them looking at me. It was hard to see because it was dark, but they were not human and had big black eyes. My little sister slept in a bed on the other side of the room, but for some reason they didn't wake her up. I started to panic once I felt a horrible vibrating sensation through my entire body, skinny gray arm, vibration, etc., etc. I used to tell my parents stories that I've been abducted by aliens. They told me not to, that they were nightmares, and I stopped thinking about it until now. And then, so she wrote about that, and then another student wrote a reply to her. Thank you for sharing your experience. I too have a vivid memory of an event like this, right? And describes, same thing, very similar experience. So I hear these things, and I'm by training a lawyer. So I'm really skeptical. Like, I know about the faults of eyewitness testimony, and I'm really skeptical. So, but hearing this, it's different when you read about it in a book of somebody who's selling the book, promoting the book, wants to make a lot of money, and be skeptical about that. It's quite another thing when there's some real people like this. And so what it says to me is that there's stuff going on that we really don't know about. And I like to think of it as we envision ourselves as the masters of the anthill. I've probably said this in class. We think we got this amazing place. It's full of tunnels. We got a queen. We dug this one all the way over there. We get some food. And this is just and we think it's the greatest thing in the world. That's what we're like. And we really have very little idea what's going on. So now I'll talk a little bit about karma. Okay? Any questions about that? Comments? Yes. It's Don, right?
Yeah. We can't really trust our memories.
Mm-hmm.
Because every time we remember something, we're actually recreating the memory.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that much of this experience may be created by ourselves. How can we really trust?
It's true. That's true, no question. And it's even true because, in a way, what's happening, what I say is right now, is not happening right now. Because it's taking a little bit of time for me to process this and for you to process this. But then I think about Karen and the reports of those patients, facts at the time describing what happened in the operating room. So I, with you, am skeptical about these things. But it doesn't mean it ain't true. Right? And so we cling to a version of facts that we take to be true. And we cling tightly to them. But the whole situation we find ourselves in is extremely bizarre. Yeah, and so we're trying to figure it out. So anyway, so it's a good point. So we have now, when you go over to the Buddhist side, we have a lot of stories like this. We had Elijah Ari, who's a reincarnate Lama, talk to us one class, just sitting there. He was in France, we were there, but describing his memories of prior life, and then describing how it was that when he went to the monastery where in his prior life he lived, he knew exactly where to walk through this whole complicated things.
That's hard to explain.
Those things are harder to explain. And then you have Dr. Stevenson from the University of Virginia, who had a whole team where he would go out when they heard there was a reincarnation story told by a young child. They'd fly out to wherever it was, usually in a Buddhist country, and interview everyone. And there are a number of stories documented, well documented, witnessed, signed off on, where a little kid, goes to a village, the little kid's never been to the village, sees a whole bunch of people, says, yeah, you're my wife, right, to a very old woman, whose husband died a few weeks before. You're this one, you're uncle this, you're that, you're that, you're that, you're that, you're that. Identifies everybody. There are a lot of stories like this that are harder to explain. So I just say this as just a little introduction. Now I'll talk a little bit about the Buddhist belief in reincarnation and karma. In the story of Buddha's very enlightenment, you remember he sat in the jungle, he was afraid, he overcame his anxiety in the Fear and Dread Sutra, my favorite sutra. And then he went and he ended up sitting under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. And the first thing that happens is he's able to remember all his past lives. And then the next thing is he remembers at will past lives of other people. And then at around dawn, he realizes the Four Noble Truths, right? We see here and in the Mahaparinirvana, the great Nirvana Sutra, he describes those Four Noble Truths. So there's a long history of that. And there's a history and here's to Don's point also, in that culture, there's a belief in reincarnation, generally speaking. And it's interesting, though, in that culture, generally, in the Indian culture at that time, and to the extent it still exists now, less and less due to the internet, the people who believe in reincarnation don't want to be reincarnated. Don't want it because they realize that just about any way they come back is bad, will be worse than what they are now. They can come back as a miserable animal, as a miserable person, God knows what. For us in the first world, especially if we're young, we think to ourselves, God, you mean I could do this again? Party on. Right? So we say, great. But so that's why in the Indian culture, traditionally, what people want is nirvana, out, moksha, liberation. They don't want to keep coming back. Whereas here, we like the idea of heaven. So we hear reincarnation, we think, yeah, heaven would be great, it would be heavenly. So this is fundamental. It's also called transmigration or metempsychosis. And who's a fan of Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses? Greatest book ever. And if you haven't read Ulysses, I beg you, please, to start about 30 pages from the end and read Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end, which I think is just some of the most amazing words ever written in English. So wonderful. I'll read you the last 2 sentences. Actually, it's like 30 pages and it's 4 sentences. And the last sentence is, I had to write this down, I was a flower of the mountain, yes, when I put the rose in my hair, like the Andalusian girls used, or shall I wear a red? Yes, and how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I? Yes. Say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. But anyway, in Ulysses, there's a great conversation. It's Leopold Bloom and his wife, Molly Bloom. And Molly is not the most literate person. That was Molly at the end. It's great. They talk about it. And he talked to her about metempsychosis, which means transmigration, reincarnation. And she thinks he's saying, met him pike hoses. And they have this whole dialogue about reincarnation. And it's really pretty right on. He says some people believe that we go on living in another body after death, that we lived before. They call it reincarnation. That we all lived before on the earth thousands of years ago or on some other planet. They say we have forgotten it, so some say they remember their past lives. So it's even in Ulysses. So And there are many, many, many stories throughout Buddhist literature on it. And if you're interested in karma and reincarnation, I urge you to read Pabonka Rinpoche's. He was a great teacher, lived in the last century. His book, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. And he talks about all these great stories. So many stories like the following. Once a monk told some people, your voice is like a dog's bark, or like a frog's croak, or like a monkey's chatter. That monk had to take 500 corresponding rebirths for each insult, as a dog or a monkey. Anything like that in the Vinaya Kudra? Endlessly. Yeah. Kaya's just translated the Vinaya Kudra, this amazing work on monks and their behavior and their code of conduct. And you find that everywhere, right? Over and over and over again. Right. Or they say a trivial virtue, right, can turn into a great result. So they talk about an emperor who ruled 4 continents, and the reason that happened was because there was a prior Buddha, a bazillion years ago, and he took a handful of lentils and he threw it, and 4 lentils went in the Buddha's begging bowl. And another one stuck on top of his head. And professors are not exempt from any of this. Pabonka says, so if you're unable to modify your behavior out of a belief in the law of cause and effect, being a scholar will be of no help at all. Okay, now of course, in the Buddhist way, we have a connection between karma and reincarnation. Reincarnation is something you find in many, many cultures all over the world for a long time. Different Amerindian, native cultures, all over the world, literally. Some of them most of them have no connection at all with how you acted, right? Some of them, it's just you come back as part of your clan. Some of them you come back as animals, sometimes you don't. But then you see in India, they started to develop this notion, starting with the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which was written down about the same time as Buddha lived, maybe a little bit before, where they start talking about karma, start talking about some connection between rebirth and ethics. And of course, we have to be suspicious of the whole thing, right? One of the things we talked about last time when we looked at how Western people interpret literature, or interpret everything. Foucault, the great writer, he wrote, power is everywhere. So, just like the notion of hell, right? What better way to keep people in line than tell them karma, right? So you always got to keep your eye on that too. But basically, it's a question of causation and the belief that for every cause there should be an effect. It's very logical. And generally speaking, the Buddhist doctrine of karma has deep respect for intentional actions. If you intentionally think something and then act on it, that has a serious imprint on your mind stream, and it stays there. Generally, there's a belief that the mind and body are separate, they're dual, and that the mind stream continues from life to life, not necessarily as a soul, like we find in some Western traditions, but as a continuum. And this goes to the whole notion of that there's not a self of persons in Buddhism. In other words, a famous story about how a Buddhist monk went to a king. His name was Milinda, and they introduced him, and he said, well, they call me, the label they give me is Nagasena, and the king says, well, what do you mean? Are you Nagasena or not? And he says, yeah, well, the label they give me is Nagasena. Actually, that's just what they call me. I'm not really that. The king says, say what? And he says, well, think about, they call it a chariot, right? But it's got wheels, it's got poles, it's got a seat. If you start taking those things away, right, would it be a chariot? At some point, no. And so he says, and the king says, but wait a minute, you're not a chariot, you're a person. And then Nagasena says, well, I'm a collection of what's called the 5 aggregates. Person's made out of 5 things, right? Form, feeling, like sensing things hot and cold, perception, we call them composites, and consciousness. And those are always changing. You know, like your cells are always changing, your consciousness is always changing. And so we call that collection of stuff that's always changing, we just give it a label like we call a chariot a chariot. So you're right, you can call me Nagasena, but it's just a label. So the notion of reincarnation with the Buddhists is just that, the changing collection of things that is you, which is the cause, gives rise to an effect. And the effect is an effect in another life that could be carried on to another life. Not necessarily as the same person, because there is no person. Okay, so and there are many stories about reincarnations, and there's very specific accounts of how to remember your past lives. One of the most well-known is in the work of Buddha Ghosa, who lived in Ceylon in the 1st century, who wrote very specifically, how do you remember your past lives? And he gave you instructions. Want to hear a little? You could do it. You could go home and do it. Okay? Okay, here's how you do it. Okay, so a monk who is a beginner should go in a solitary retreat, right, after you've collected your alms. And then you should go into these 4 states of meditation they call the dhyanas or jhanas, which have to do with concentration, and then eventually feeling rapturous and joyful, but then letting go of that, and you end up with a feeling of just equanimity and concentration. And then, once you've done that, you've kind of cleared yourself out, you're in that very concentrated state of mind, think about what you did. He says he should then think about his most recent act of sitting down to meditate, next to the preparation of the seat, going backwards in time. The entry to the lodging, putting away the bowl and the outer robe, time of eating, time of returning from the village, getting alms, entering the village, setting out from the monastery, paying homage, etc., 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 and go all the way back to the morning, and then night, and then the day before. And he says, if you lose it, you can't do it, just like a woodcutter sharpens her axe, go back and go back into those states of concentration. And then you don't have to go all the way back again. You can start where you lost it and go back and keep going back, and so on and so forth. 2nd day back, 3rd, 4th, 5th day, 10 days, as far back as a year, 10 years, 20 years, until as far back as to when you attained your form in the womb, and go all the way back there. And then it's hard to get back to the previous birth. But you do it. You go back to that state of concentration, and you do it. And with practice, they say, you can go all the way back and do it. It's prescribed step by step. It says, just as when a strong man is felling a big tree for the purpose of making a peak of a gable of a roof, but's unable to cut it down because the axe has been blunted by lopping the branches and foliage, still he doesn't give up. He goes to a smithy and has his axe sharpened, and he returns and keeps chopping down the tree. Same thing. You can do it. And then go on and on and on and on. And we talked about who is being reincarnated. There's no substantial self. Any questions so far about any of this? It's a lot. It's a lot of the Buddhist path. Yes?
Have you seen your past life before?
You're asking me personally? I have two things. One is when I was a kid, I had a recurrent dream where I was falling in a vortex. Wow, I never thought of that. Falling in a vortex, and I heard chanting, which went, and I wrote it down when I was a kid, when I was very young. It went, Many Ginahogan, Many Ginahogan. And I thought that was probably American Indian chant, Many Ginahogan. Then later, when I heard monks chanting. I said, Many Om, Many Om, Many Om, Many Om, Many. Could have been Om Mani Padme Hum. And I had this recurrently, Now what it means, who knows, Who knows? I mean, but this was long before I was interested in Buddhism or anything speculative. So at least there's not that thing. And then there was something else that happened there where, I had a dream. It's an extraordinary dream. My name is Kittay, Kittay means China. And when I was probably about 20, I had a dream, but it was one of these dreams, you ever have them where you just like wake up and it's like, oh, whoa, what was that? Not like a regular dream. I've had maybe 2 or 3 of these in my life. Anyway, I was going down the Oxus River. I was dressed in furs, and then the sun rose from the east from behind a mountain and illuminated the whole landscape. So then I woke up and I went, whoa. It's like 6 in the morning. I said, Oxus River, what's that? So I looked up in the dictionary. It turned out that was the ancient name for the rivers now called the Amu Darya River. And then I did some research and I found that there was a tribe out of Manchuria called the Kittays, and they had conquered China. And actually, it turns out that one of the Kittays, a prince of the Kittays, whose name was Yelu Chutsai, was Genghis Khan's prime minister, and actually saved more lives than anyone in history by convincing Genghis that instead of killing people when he conquered them, he should keep them alive and tax them. Terrible. Maybe it was a slow death. So then I did all this research. I said, oh, fine, Chusai, oh, fine. He was a Kittay, and then it turned out that the Kittays were then driven out of China. They had founded the Liao dynasty in northern China. They were driven out by the succeeding wave of people from Manchuria or Mongolia, the Jurchens, and then they fled to the west, and they set up a kingdom called the Kingdom of the Black Kittays, which was on the banks of the Amu Darya River, the Oxus, the present name for the Oxus. And then I started thinking, okay, fine, Kittay. Kittay means in China, and in Russian and Polish it means China. And it probably comes from those people, the Kittay, who conquered China and then got scattered. Hope I'm not taking too long. Is this too long? Okay. So then I figured, okay, so how do we get Jewish? And then I read a book by Arthur Kessler, who's a great author, who talked about, it was called, what was Kessler's book? But he talked about the kingdom of the Kittays. And what happened was they had the Christians on one side and the Muslims on the other side. And so the king decided that he and all the people would convert to a religion, not that and not that. So they all became Jewish. And so I figure that what happened was my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather swam across the river one night and knocked up my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. And the bastard looked like he came from the east, so they called it Kittay. Okay, but here's a weird thing. A few years ago, here at Tibet House, I met a woman named Diane Wolf. And Diane is a scholar. She's probably the leading scholar, by coincidence, on Yelu Chutsai, this Kittay. And she's done a tremendous amount of research on it. And then, about 2 months ago, she sent me the travel journals of Yelu Chutsai and his travel journals in Central Asia, where he was going up a river like that. And I just went, whoa. So I have no idea. I have no idea what any of it means. When my son went to get tested, 23andMe, expecting, Genghis Khan's blood to run through his veins, he was deeply disappointed. But I had to remind him that these things are karmic and not genetic. So maybe a little. Who knows? Okay. So maybe I'll just end up. I got like 4 minutes, 5 minutes. I'll end up with just talking a little bit about what I'm thinking about, because especially if some of you are strong in the sciences, I need your help, okay? There are many theories of quantum mechanics. You know, quantum mechanics came on in the beginning of 20th century, revolutionized everything with the double slit experiment and the notion of superposition, really revolutionized everything. But way back when, Niels Bohr and Einstein, they couldn't really agree on like what it meant. But so they kind of decided, okay, we'll shut up and calculate. And so quantum mechanics is now the basis of so many things that we use, and it works. It works. It works down to the last item. But starting about 10, 20 years ago, people started to get back to the question of, okay, like what does it mean? And there are several theories about what it means, and one that's very intriguing to me. In the usual theory, the Copenhagen interpretation was that basically when you measure things are either particles or waves. They have a wave-particle duality, and when you measure a wave, it collapses, and then you can see where things are. Right? Before that, you can't see where things are. That somehow the interaction or the measurement, the observation, not necessarily the intervention of consciousness. People take it that far, you know, that mind is really creating everything. But there's no question that it's really very different than we ever thought, than we ever learned in Newtonian physics. And so what I'm thinking about, and a man named Everett, he wrote a dissertation. He said, really, it could be many worlds. What happens when we observe things is it's kind of the line splits into many worlds. And then a guy named Michael Lockwood, who wrote a really good book called Mind, Brain, and Quantum, he came up with a philosophy of it, which he calls many minds theory, and which has been endorsed by some people, in which, say you're drinking a cup of tea. Well, at the same time, there's you somewhere else, some other multiverse is drinking a cup of coffee. And what exists are kind of these layers of possibility on top of each other. And this all has to do with kind of these quantum gravitational fields also that Rovelli was talking about, the kind of shiftiness of the whole thing. So anyway, so what I'm thinking about, okay, since I approach it with an interest in Buddhist practice, what could this tell us about meditation and about particularly the way to become a Buddha, which is described in the tantras as first you intensely visualize a mandala with others or yourself as a beautiful deity. I mean, you just look into the shrine room in there, you get an idea of the beautiful space you'd be in, and you'd observe it very intensely. You'd memorize how many arms, what it looks like, what the buildings look like, the layers of jewels and ornamentation in the buildings. You spend a lot of time doing this over a lot of years, a lot of practice. So what I wonder about is whether through some process you're actually determining your reality. That in other words, when Tibetans undertook these practices, they undertook the practices because the priest said we should do this, right? Or my Lama, my teacher, says I should do this. But we don't normally come to these things with this kind of belief. It's just kind of not in our DNA. And so it could be that by looking at the science of it, we could have not necessarily the knowledge, oh, this is exactly how it works, but almost a reverse version of Pascal's wager, which is Pascal, he was saying, well, I don't know if God exists, but if God does exist, and maybe I'll spend some of my time being good, so if God does exist, I won't be screwed. Right? So it's kind of reverse Pascal's wager. Maybe if this explanation could be true, and that devotion to practice and visualizing and intensely observing could shape the outcome, because we know that the things, when we observe them, they manifest. That's a principle of science. That there could be a deep connection here. And so, now at stage I've read about enough, I've pursued enough of it, and I have dialogue with some of my scientist friends who, we just have a different way of looking at it. So anyway, so it's something I'd like to continue with. Any questions, comments, any of this? Okay, thanks for turning out. Thank you.
This video was brought to you in part through the generous support of the Tibet House US membership community and viewers like you. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, please visit tibethouse.us. Thanks for watching. Tashi Delek.